Welcome back to the place for all things mirrorless, and today we're looking at one of the most fundamental parts of your camera, without which it can do nothing. If you want to know how to look after your sensor, check out this episode. Right up until the mid-2000s, the film industry was absolutely booming. There simply was no other photographic medium. There was no other way of recording images. We all knew what to do. You took one of these and you would put it into one of these and off you go. That was the way it always had been, and that was the way it always would be, until, of course, it wasn't. In about the mid-1990s, I became aware of an entirely new way of making images, and this new method was not chemical. Film photography requires chemicals. It relies on chemicals sprayed onto the backing, the celluloid backing, and the chemicals, silver bromide usually, I believe, respond to the light. Well, this new method, didn't use chemicals at all. Instead, it was an electronic way of making images. It relied on binary code, and it coincided with the rise of the computer market, the personal computer market. In the 2000s, that market was booming. Anybody who could buy a computer did buy one, because that was the new tech of the time. Computers use binary code, and the new electronic cameras also used binary code to store their information in a string of ones and zeros. The new cameras didn't use film. Instead, they used an electronic sensor comprised of millions and millions and millions of tiny little pixels. Now, what are pixels? Well, pixels are tiny individual sensors that are sensitive to light. Digital photography was invented by Kodak, and that's kind of ironic because Kodak actually went bankrupt because they didn't get into digital quickly enough, and you know, they're well known for that. It's a sort of a case study in business studies about relying on an old product and the lack of wisdom in doing that. Kodak relied on film far longer than they should have done, and all around them in the 2000s, digital was making real progress, and eventually Kodak went bankrupt because of that. But regardless of what Kodak was doing, film was replaced by digital gradually during the 2000s, from 2000 to 2010. The resolution of the images from the first digital cameras was very, very low, and you could actually see those individual pixels. Such was the low resolution of the cameras. But they worked, and pixels and sensors developed over the years to a point where you couldn't see the pixels anymore. At first it was dismissed as pretty much irrelevant, really, little more than a toy, and I've got to admit, I was among the people saying that. I really couldn't see that this digital photography, with its very low resolution, would replace film certainly anytime soon. Not for decades and decades in my imagination at that time. My goodness, how wrong I and other people like me were, because digital gained ground. The technology got better, the resolution got better, and you can see why digital photography became popular very quickly. And as quickly as it did, it's much cheaper than film photography. You don't have to buy film, you don't have to pay for developing. It's much easier. You don't have to load film, you don't have to take film out, you don't have to develop it. If you do, you're developing yourself. There's no need to do that. It's just much, much easier to do. It's a more simple and, you know, less complex, less cumbersome process. And it offered pretty much effectively infinite shots, not just 36. I remember seeing on a very early memory card that it could store 1,000 or so photos, and my goodness, I was blown away by this, and I thought the future really had arrived. And that was one of the tremendous advantages of digital photography at that time, and still is, of course. By 2000, Canon released this camera. This is pretty much an antique now, so quickly has digital photography progressed. This is the Canon PowerShot G1, and this camera has 3.3 megapixels of resolution. It has a CCD sensor rather than a CMOS sensor that we used in later cameras. And actually this is a really nice little camera, and it's a really compact all-in-one little thing, and you know, it can take on the world. You could take this camera anywhere and get nice images out of it. And this is what you could buy in the year 2000, and by the year 2007 there were a lot of these cameras about. This is a small point and shoot. Resolution had increased to 12 megapixels by this point. There were loads of these cameras around at the time, and they were replaced very quickly afterwards by phone cameras, and there are, you know, you can't really buy a camera like this anymore. I'm not sure that anybody really makes one. They were completely exceeded and outdone and replaced by phone cameras. In 2005, I bought a 10 megapixel Nikon D80 SLR, and in 2008, I bought a 12 megapixel Nikon D90 SLR. So you can see that within that decade, digital photography matured, and by the end of the decade, by the end of the 2000s, digital resolution had far exceeded the resolution of film, and digital technology and photography had completely taken over the market. Now, although these new digital cameras were very similar to film cameras, and although anybody who had used only film could very easily pick up this camera and use it, it's very familiar, despite that, they're not the same thing. This is a fundamentally different machine to a film camera. The digital camera is essentially a computer. Now, one way we can understand or characterize computers is as a simulation device. A computer, like the one I'm reading from now, in fact, can simulate lots of different single function machines. So, for example, the word processor that I typed all this stuff up on last night simulates a typewriter. It's not a typewriter, but it works like one. It's very familiar. It's very similar to one. The idea of a typewriter is present, and that idea is reproduced digitally. It's simulated. Another example, the nonlinear edit software that I'm going to edit this video on later today. Well, that simulates a Steenbeck edit machine, at least in principle. There's no Steenbeck present, there's no edit machine present, only the idea of one. And in a similar way, we can say that a digital camera like this simulates a camera like this that uses film. It's not the same. It works like it's the same. It works in a very similar way. That is, to use it's very similar. But the older analog machine is present in this digital camera only as an idea. The digital camera is simulating the film camera. Now, because this digital camera uses binary code to store its information, you can manipulate images much more easily than you could do with a film camera. You can manipulate them in camera before you shoot. You can change settings in camera before you shoot, and you can change them afterwards on a computer which simulates a dark room. So Lightroom, for example, that software Lightroom simulates the old chemical darkroom. Now, it was possible to edit film images too in a very similar way to what we do in Photoshop or Lightroom, but it took much longer. It was much more messy, and it was generally a lot more difficult. So that, again, is a big advantage for cameras that use electronic sensors that record in binary code. Film, like the film that was once in this canister, is tough. It's actually very physically strong. Film is cheap, so you don't need to rely on the same piece of film over and over again. You just replace it, and there's no real problem with damaging the film. Sensors are neither tough nor are they cheap. They're a permanent thing that you don't change. They sit in your camera and they stay there, and they have to last the life of the camera. They're neither tough nor cheap, and they need to be taken care of. Now, if you're watching this channel, there's a fair chance that you've got a mirrorless camera, and the sensors in mirrorless cameras are particularly vulnerable to damage. Why? Because they sit just almost directly behind the lens. If you take the lens off your mirrorless camera, you'll see there's the sensor very, very close to the throat of the lens. So mirrorless camera sensors are particularly vulnerable. How do we look after them? Well, first and most obviously, don't drop your camera. Don't shock the sensor in any way. That is easily said, and anyone can make a mistake and have an accident. I once dropped my very beautiful Rolleiflex camera, at which I was devastated, and it fell right onto solid concrete. So anyone can make a mistake, but first and foremost, protect your sensor from shock. They are extremely delicate electronic components, and they have literally millions and millions of tiny little sensors, which we call pixels, inside them. So protect them from shock. Carry your camera in a case. Use your camera strap. Don't just hold it. If you hold it, no strap, eventually the chances are you might drop it. So use that neck strap. That's there for a reason. I always use mine. Digital sensors are very sensitive to dust, and dust is a real problem, or can be a real problem with them. I remember on my Nikon D80, which didn't have a self-cleaning feature. Most cameras have a self-cleaning feature now, where when you switch them on, the sensor will vibrate very fast for a very short amount of time and throw off any dust that happens to have landed on it. But before that was a thing, before that tech was a thing, in my Nikon D80, for example, dust was a horrendous problem, and I was always getting little bits of dust on the images, and constantly trying to clear out the dust. The best way to do that, if you do get dust on your sensor, the best way to do that is to use a blower. Give it a quick blow, and the air will blow everything out of the way and will clean your sensor up nicely for you. Don't change your lenses in dusty environments, but if you have to, or in fact any time you're changing lenses, take your lens off your camera and hold it downwards so that no dust can get into the sensor. If you hold it upwards, there's a lot of dust in the air. Hold it upwards and that dust is going to fall down, come down onto your sensor, and it's going to be all dusty and messy. So turn your camera over and put it upside down if you're changing lenses. If the startup cleaning process of your sensor doesn't get rid of the dust, and you've used a blower and that won't get rid of the dust, then it is possible to very carefully chemically clean your sensor. There are kits you can buy to do that, or many camera shops will do that for you. If you do it yourself, you've got to be really, really careful not to scratch the sensor. So be very careful not to get anything abrasive in there. Be very careful not to add any dust while you're doing it. Do it in a dust-free environment as far as you can, and apply as little physical force as possible to that sensor. Remember, the physical force is secondary to the chemical cleaning that's going on. Also, be very careful not to point your camera at the sun, especially if the lens is focused to infinity. If that catches the sun will be focused to a very, very tiny point on your sensor, and if that's there for any length of time, it could feasibly, plausibly cause damage to your sensor. I should say at this point that I actually have pointed all of my camera's sensors at the sun at one time or another when I'm doing lens tests. So I'll stop the aperture down to its very smallest aperture, I'll focus to infinity, and if the sun's out, I will point the camera very briefly at the sun and take a shot. So what I'm doing when I'm doing that is I'm testing a lens to see whether it will make sun stars or not. Most lenses, or many lenses, when you close them right down and photograph any very bright light source like the sun, will make a lovely star pattern with beams, points radiating out of it. And I kind of like sun stars. So I have pointed my sensor at the sun for very, very short periods of time. And I've done it with all my cameras and I haven't suffered any damage whatsoever, at least not that I can see. However, common sense tells us that if you do point a sensor at the sun for any length of time, focused to infinity, there's a huge amount of energy in the sun, and common sense tells us that that will do some damage. So although I've taken a risk with my sensors and I have pointed at the sun, I've only done it very, very briefly. So don't do it for an extended period of time. Keep your lens cap on. If it's a sunny day and you're out and about, keep your lens cap on. Whether the sun can burn a sensor, I don't really know, but I have seen sensors with burn marks on them. That could have come from the sun. I know certainly and for definite that lasers will damage a digital sensor, because my son experimented with his laser years ago, and his phone, he was trying to photograph directly down the barrel of the laser, and the laser did in fact burn his sensor out, which is not entirely surprising. So lasers are definitely off limits. Never ever photograph lasers or laser light pointing directly at your camera, because that is likely to damage it. Now, there is a whole debate also about whether radioactive lenses will damage your sensor. If we think about it, particles coming out of a lens, coming out of the thorium oxide in a lens, traveling at very high speed, bang, hitting your sensor. On the face of it, that seems like, yes, that could very easily, very plausibly and conceivably cause some damage. As I understand it, what comes out of thorium oxide, the thorium oxide in lenses, are alpha particles, and they are, as far as I understand it, which isn't a huge amount, but as far as I understand it, alpha particles are said not to be particularly energetic and not to be able to cause damage to a sensor. But these lenses are getting old now, and it's possible that some other particles are coming out of them, some heavier, higher energy particles, and they could conceivably, if that happens, they could conceivably damage your sensor. In practice, however, it just doesn't seem to happen. I've had highly radioactive lenses like the Pentax 50mm f1.4 on my Sony A7 camera for, well, I think on one occasion I left it on there for months, and the sensor suffered absolutely no damage whatsoever. It was as good when I sold that camera. The sensor was as good as when I bought it. I don't think radioactive lenses did it any harm at all, but perhaps I was lucky. Perhaps there are certain lenses that do give out rather more energetic radiation than others. But all I can say is that in practice, it just doesn't seem to be a problem at all. Generally, sensors in digital cameras seem to be very long-lived and very reliable. They don't seem to break down too often. I've certainly never had one, touch wood, I've certainly never had one conk out on me, but they do go wrong, and it's important to know how to take the best care of them. So I hope we've gone some way towards explaining what a sensor is today, explaining how they work and what sort of things they need to be protected from, and how you can protect your sensor so that it will keep on giving a good service life for many, many years. So I guess that's about it from me for this week. Many thanks for watching, and if you've watched this far, a particular thanks to you. Many, many thanks go to subscribers for your support, and if you've enjoyed this show, you might want to become a subscriber yourself. That would be really appreciated. Many, many thanks go to patrons for your support, and I couldn't make this show in the way that I do without that support, so many, many thanks for that. And if you think this show's not doing too bad a job of keeping the old cameras and lenses alive, you might want to become a patron yourself over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that from $1 per month. As for me, that is it for now, but if you're not doing anything too bothersome, awkward, irritating, annoying, irksome, or downright horrible at around this time next week, please do check in and join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.